right, it's past 10:30, so we're gonna convene the Monterey County Homelessness Committee. Well, Supervisor Askew and I are online. Well, she's online, I'm present. Any additions or corrections?
There are none.
All right, let's go to comments from the public for items not on today's agenda. We'll allow for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to speak on items not on today's agenda. Seeing none, let's go to approval of the minutes for June 27th. You good with those, Supervisor Askew?
I am, yes, thank you.
Any comments from the public on these minutes from our last meeting? Seeing none, we'll deem those approved by consensus. Let's go to our regular agenda. We have only 2 items today. Let's go to receive a verbal update on the Encampment Resolution Funding projects by Roxanne.
Thank you. As we are all aware, the County of Monterey is the recipient of 3 Encampment Resolution Funding Awards. The first one we received was ERF2, and that is the one that addresses the largest encampment in unincorporated areas, which happens to be in the town of Pajaro, or right outside the town of Pajaro, bordering the city of Watsonville and the county of Santa Cruz. We are really in it right now. We just resubmitted updated plans, and we do anticipate that we will get feedback from the city within the next week or 2. The city has been phenomenal to work with. And so far, as I said many times, I'm very confident that we will move forward on getting the tiny village up and running by the time the ERF grant is done, or by the ERF grant period is over. The other 2 was from ERF round 3, and we do not have the standard agreement from the state yet, but Sarah has been working with the city of Soledad and the city of King. And she is in the process of drafting all of the agreements necessary for us to move those projects forward. The Board of Supervisors will be expecting to receive the first contract that we are going to roll out, and that's in partnership with the city of Soledad. So they can start doing the outreach services and getting motel vouchers. This is an amendment number 3. The first 2 amendments didn't have to go to board because it didn't require, we didn't have the threshold that requires board action. So you guys will be receiving that soon. And then we did hear word from the state that the ERF standard agreements and checks will be rolling out within the next couple of weeks. So those are my updates for the ERFs.
All right, Supervisor Askew? Questions?
No questions here, thank you.
Okay, I got a couple questions, Roxanne. First of all, on the Watsonville tiny homes village, do we anticipate that opening before the winter? I know the winter always seems to be that period where we're looking to having to coordinate with the county of Santa Cruz to remove individuals who are living in the river channel. The storms always present a real danger for those residents. Do you anticipate that we may be open that soon, or what do you anticipate that it will take longer?
I do not think it'll be open by winter. We were doing everything we can to try to get it up and done, up and through the process before winter, but it's just not working out that way. So I will be trying to identify an alternative strategy for folks so they're not displaced.
I'm glad your communication is going good with the city, right? That's great. But I was concerned, because it is campaign season, and there's some individuals trying to politicize the tiny homes project. There's also a small group of opponents on the community side, and who are, I believe, in my opinion, from what I've seen, they're misconstruing information about the tiny homes. So I would just suggest, I don't know what we can do on our side to maybe as it gets closer, but I don't want the misinformation to be factors that might have some of the council members trying to put up barriers as it moves forward. Because they seem to be the loud ones, and that if nobody else is speaking, then I don't hope that the city staff won't change direction on this project. So the piece was, that I wanted to stress was on the communication part. How can we get real facts out about the project? When's it coming? So the public knows who's it's gonna serve, who's gonna operate it, how it's gonna work, whether it's in an op-ed, whether it's on social media targeted to Watsonville residents. I want to be ahead of the messaging versus letting the misinformation, misconstrue this project and perhaps create unnecessary barriers where we could educate the public and our partners on the council about how this project is really going to work and operate. Have they decided on who the provider is going to be?
Yes, Community Action Board has signed their agreement with the coalition. So we were put in a situation where we had to expend 100% or 50% of the funding. And we did meet with the state, and the state allowed us to move the money through the coalition. It would show up as expended on our side. And then they just executed the agreement after Maria Elena, the executive director of CAB, met with county leadership. So she had a meeting with Nick Chulos and Debbie Palinelli to talk about the project as a whole. We have done, Supervisor, 2 community input sessions and 2 city council meetings on this project. And we are actively working with the church to establish a neighborhood watch. A lot of the complaints that the neighbors had existed long before this project had even come to light as a possibility. So we are trying to raise up more community awareness and also just community in action. So when there are issues with their neighborhoods, they know the right chain of command to get it to for their issues to be resolved.
2 things on that. The reason I'm bringing it up because I know it was concerned to my counterpart, or our counterpart, Supervisor Felipe Hernandez. He's working on an op-ed on this because he thought the communication was important because of what he's hearing. So just so you know, so I'm hearing it from other folks as well that the ongoing communication, right? Because it's been, I think, a while since we had one of the meetings, and not everybody attends those meetings, right? So we have to do the broader messaging to the public at large. And then the other part for community action board, they do a lot of good things, right? But I don't think they've done like managing a homeless. They haven't worked as a homeless service provider, and so the suggestion there was maybe who could we help better train them on how to be successful in the operations and also on the rapid rehousing component, because they've never done that either, and their staff haven't done it. So that's where, when we open it, it's one success, but then the ongoing successful operation is what I worry about for a provider who's never done work in this particular area.
So they do have the YHCP grant, and they are doing rapid rehousing for 18 to 24-year-olds. And they do have Watsonville Work. So they do have a few small programs that serve people experiencing homelessness. We did put enough money in their budget to hire a consultant. And I also have another consultant from Los Angeles that is really open to helping at no cost, actually. So I think that in general, both of the county's staff want this to work, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that CAB is prepared to take on this level of work. And other nonprofits have also offered just to meet with them. So they have met with Community Human Services. They met with a few other organizations, and we've taken them on tours in different areas around the state.
Great. All right, that's on. We stay vigilant on this, I want this to be a success story, and that's all I'm trying to convey.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Let's go to the public. Any comments from the public or any of our staff on this item? Don't see nobody in chambers, nobody online. All right, that was just an update. Thank you, Roxanne. Let's go to our last item. This is a presentation regarding the 19 strategies for communities to address encampments humanely and effectively. And we have special guests today, do we?
We do. We do. So joining us today, we have Helene Schneider, who works for the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness.
Thank you, Roxanne, for the opportunity to speak to people throughout Monterey County. My name's Helene Schneider. I'm the Senior Regional Advisor for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and I'll talk briefly about what the heck that is if you're not aware. I know that not many people know about this federal interagency, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm in your neck of the woods. I live in Santa Barbara, California. I cover California as part of my, California is my region, and love Monterey County and all the places around that area. Go up there pretty often on a personal level. So to be able to connect with you regularly, just want to appreciate the work that you do each and every day. And so we'll talk a little bit about this addressing encampments humanely and effectively. And I really hope also to hear from you and get some dialogue going as well. I know we have about half an hour-ish, a little more for that kind of presentation. So first off, about what USICH is, this federal interagency has been around since the late 80s. And it has 19 different federal departments, all focused together on preventing and ending homelessness in the nation. So agencies that you would think about, federal partners like HUD, VA, HHS, but also Department of the Interior, Education, Labor, FEMA is part of this, the Domestic Policy Council, the White House, the Post Office, AmeriCorps. So 19 different federal agencies all focused on the issue. We are that hub that keeps everyone interconnected, and we connect with our federal partners on the work. Our current chair, they have one member of each of the 19 agencies who serve on our council. They meet quarterly. HHS Secretary Becerra is our current chair, and Secretary Vilsack from Department of Agriculture is our vice chair. And they appoint an executive director. His name's Jeff Olivet. He's been with us for about 2.5 years now. And then I serve as a member of the National Initiatives team. There's 6 of us around the country that connect what goes on in DC with federal resources and policies to local communities. But really what's so important is that last bit on this screen here, which is how do we support all levels of government and the private sector and philanthropy to efficient and effective strategies. So that really requires us knowing what's going on in local communities and bring those issues and challenges and opportunities back up to Washington and our federal partners. So it's an interchange, intergovernmental and change in that way as well. I mentioned the different, there's all a bunch of logos there, our seals of the 19 different federal agencies. We have council policy groups. We have a federal strategic plan, which I'll get to in a moment. And that relates to addressing unsheltered homelessness. Just to put in context, the big picture here about just putting in the last point in time count numbers that HUD put out and seeing what the comparison were. And we saw on a nationwide level, we did see homelessness rise overall by 12% and from 2022. And, you know, what happened was in the context around that, especially also if we're looking at the rate of homelessness, California, as we well know, and the West Coast in particular, sees numbers of people experiencing homelessness in a much higher rate than other areas, except for maybe New York City, right? That's been the highest level of people experiencing homelessness, also a very large city, of course. But things to think about here in terms of there's sheltered homelessness and unsheltered homelessness. And we in California were number 1, unfortunately, in terms of the rate of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness versus sheltered homelessness. And that's for a whole variety of reasons over time in terms of not having enough interim shelter options available, to the cost of housing being higher, to, you know, but mostly because of the lack of availability of shelter opportunities. And so over time, we've seen that versus in other places around the nation that do have different shelter opportunities. And then coupled that with the rise of high cost of housing, rise of rents not keeping pace with wages, and you see more and more people fall into homelessness on the West Coast in particular. I do want to put some context in those numbers though. And again, it's the point in time count. I know you all did that. You did the one, everyone does this in January. We'll get the 2024 numbers from HUD later this year. So this is older data, but we were very interested in seeing this trend of what we thought would happen when COVID hit, when the pandemic hit. There was a big fear, and you may have recalled this, that we might see a huge rise in homelessness during the pandemic. And what happened was there were a lot of different funding options and different ways of looking at interim shelter and non-congregate shelter to keep people healthy and mitigating the spread of the virus that actually ended up leveling off the rate of homelessness in our country during that time. So between the CARES Act funding and then also the American Rescue Plan Act funding, all that work that many counties and cities, yourself included, chose to use discretionary funds through the American Rescue Plan Act towards eviction prevention and assisting tenants, helping with a whole variety of homelessness services. That really worked. The child credit that happened, the child tax credits. And then when those fundings expired, homelessness went right back up again. So I think it's really important to know that homelessness really is a policy choice, right? That we make policies that have impacts, and how we put money together and how we expend those funds and how we collaborate has impacts one way or another. And so that was really something we learned quite a bit from COVID, which a couple of things. One is that housing is healthcare. And it really helped in terms of mitigating the spread of the virus. It also helped people get the services they needed, particularly in non-congregate shelter, to then connect them into successful housing in a sustainable way. And seeing that when you fund things to the scale that it needs and provide both the housing and the services together, you will at least, if not cap the rate of growth of homelessness, but actually, and now we're also seeing some declines in areas as well when that continual funding and services come together. As I mentioned, the USICH, we put together a federal strategic plan. And so our federal strategic plan, the current administration's, is called All In. And in there, and there's the link right there if you want to look at every detail here. It's quite a big document. But here it is in a nutshell. We're looking at three major foundational pillars of equity, data and evidence, and collaboration, that any community needs to focus on those three foundational pillars when they're looking at an approach and a policy of what kind of priorities to put together in terms of your services and housing opportunities. So lead with equity, look at the policies and how that might relate to providing services to people who are most vulnerable. We know that homelessness affects people of color at a much higher rate than the standard population in those areas. Supporting your decisions with good data and evidence, and then obviously the collaboration piece, not just within county government, for example, but between federal, state, local governments, with the housing community, with private developers, with business and philanthropy, social service providers coming together. And then the solutions are three components here. One is certainly providing, leveling up the housing and supports that are necessary to help those in need. And we are in a dearth of housing units and supplies. We also need to up the level of services that we need on an ongoing basis. There's been a lot of work in California, as we know, in terms of moving those two things along, but we still have a ways to go to meet the actual need. And then there are two other components, and one, prevention, I'll just touch on briefly, and we're going to focus mostly on crisis response. But homelessness prevention is something USICH is starting to look at much more deeply and much more upstream, and looking at what are things that we can do way early on that will prevent homelessness in the first place. Because what we're seeing in the numbers is communities like yourselves are doing amazing work getting individuals and groups of people from encampments or from shelters into housing, but more people are falling into homelessness for the first time. And that's what's keeping the numbers from going down. And it's actually what's contributing amongst the rise in homelessness. So what can we do upstream in terms of working with education systems, with the criminal justice system, working with cash assistance programs? What can we do to prevent homelessness from happening in the first place? And counties, I think in particular, are particularly an important role model and important leader here, because that's the role of counties, is you are the social service net, safety net for your community. So thinking about it in a little different way than just at the moment of crisis. But I really want to focus today on this crisis response and really addressing the immediate need, the life and death situation that we see of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in encampments, especially under current policies that are happening now, and grappling with the state of play really right now, especially in California. Again, just to think big picture here, when we did the federal strategic plan, we did a whole number of focus groups and different listening sessions, and including with over 500 people who self-identified as someone with lived experience of homelessness. And so some of the quotes coming here are so important, such as services are not effective without housing, but housing is not sustainable without services. And that piece there is really very important to remember here. And also just to talk about the response system itself and how to go about doing so. This quote here, I think, is pretty impactful. You cannot ignore the major effect of criminalization of homelessness. It makes it harder for unsheltered people to get housing, and it impacts health by compounding trauma. And so what can we do under the challenges that we see, which are many, in terms of helping those who are most vulnerable, helping those who are in need, and providing things in a communal way that where the whole community can get together and really focus on lasting results, as opposed to kind of moving the problem around and managing it and not solving the issue. So this is a very busy slide, and there's a whole section in our federal strategic plan when we put out these 19 strategies here. But what we did was look at, well, how can we best humanely and effectively look at and address people living in encampments and work with them into moving them into housing and supportive services, looking at the pillars that I just talked about in our federal strategic plan. And so if you can see here, and we can, if you want, go into more detail in our conversation about what it means in terms of these 19 different strategies, but you can see that they're categorized amongst our pillars. So in terms of equity, for example, making sure to engage with the people experiencing homelessness on what works for them, right? Finding out what actually is successful opportunities, what has not worked in the past, bringing them to the table as decision makers as much as possible, because they are being directly impacted. Many people, as you may know, you may have heard the term "nothing about us without us," right? If you're impacted yourself, you want to be part of the solution. It also gets those individuals involved connected to their own success, and they have a role in it to play themselves, as opposed to something happening to them. So engaging with them is really something that we value highly. The collaboration piece is kind of obvious to say. Of course, you need to talk with a whole lot of different agencies who are working on the issue and make sure the right hands know what the left hand is doing. And but not just amongst government, but also a big part of this has to do with connecting with your neighbors, with local businesses, keeping them informed, engaged, involved in addressing the issue, and so that they're aware of what's happening, and also to help keep the narrative and the messaging clear and without having miscommunications and lack of understanding run counter to what it is that you're trying to do. Having the data and evidence. I am a firm believer that success breeds success. And when you show a project that's working and you have the data and evidence to show it, showing that might help then as a pilot project or some other kind of trial that you're working on, when it works, to use that data to then expand and to continue those best practices moving forward, and to track that status, to show the accountability of what you're doing. Your crisis response piece, really looking at when you're focusing on an encampment area, it doesn't just happen overnight, right? This is something that takes time to build, to figure out what the needs are, figuring out what's available to those in the community. What are their basic health needs? What's the housing focused availability? Where's areas that you can provide storage, so that way people feel more comfortable saying yes from leaving their tent and moving into either a non-congregate or interim shelter housing option towards a permanent housing solution. and then providing those access and services in the housing and support. What are the pathways here? And making sure that there's a flow of moving from talking about an encampment area to ideally someone can move right into a housing unit. But typically, particularly in California, that is really hard. And I hear all the time from communities, what do we do in the meantime? We're doing everything we can to provide new housing opportunities, and that takes time. There's permitting, there's financing, there's all the rehab, whatever is necessary. There's the matching the vouchers with the people. But meanwhile, we don't want people to languish and die on the streets. So what do we do in the meantime that is effective, that's not too cost prohibitive, but also is a flow from that interim solution into permanent housing? And that is a critical piece, because as you grapple with your budgets, which you have to, the pie's only so big, and you have to make decisions on how to spend especially discretionary dollars. You want to make sure you use those funds as the most effective way possible. And so having an interim solution really truly should be interim, right? How do you get people to go into those areas for a limited period of time, because you know that you then really focus on connecting them to a permanent housing solution at the other end. And then you can reuse that interim solution bed or facility for more people, as you're trying to clear different areas and bring areas that have encampments back to their original intended use. So that whole process doesn't happen overnight, right? There's a lot of outreach that happens. There's a lot of coordination that happens, and a trust building. As I'm sure you are aware, many people who are experiencing particularly unsheltered homelessness, it didn't happen to them overnight. Things happened to them, and they lost a lot of trust in a system. Something happened that maybe it will take a while for them to feel okay of saying yes to a certain opportunity, and how they're being approached, who is approaching them, what's being offered, how are they engaged in their own success is very critical, and a lot of times won't happen with the first ask. And so that doesn't mean it's a no forever. It's trying to figure out what is it that we can do to help people get to make that connection and to feel trustworthy, trusting that is going to last for them, because they probably have been in a situation where something was offered to them and then something else fell through, and they don't want to go through that again, because that's a very traumatic experience, of course. And then the prevention piece too, right? And building and strengthening the safety nets, interrupting the pipelines into homelessness that we talked about. I mentioned the prevention piece as well. But then certainly also looking at how do you, as I mentioned, bringing an encampment area back into its original purpose. So whether it could be a freeway off-ramp area or a creek bed area, trying to monitor these areas so they don't get repopulated by others who then want to, recreate an encampment. So this is part of the 19 strategies that we have here. And the document that we have on our website really goes into a lot of detail on each of these different 19 strategies. I want to mention just a few other best practices, because I do want to have plenty of time for us to have a conversation. But, California has never seen as much funding coming around. And as Roxanne was mentioning, all the different funding sources from the state and from the federal government. And it's really tricky sometimes to put those puzzle pieces together, especially also if you have discretionary funds. And how do you make sure that the discretionary funds you use are really there for that gap financing, and you're not using discretionary funds when there's another piece of the puzzle that can actually address a specific issue. CalAIM, I think, is a great example of this. And I know Monterey County has been really great in the forefront, as I've seen throughout the state, of leveraging Medi-Cal dollars, reimbursement dollars, to provide healthcare services that relate to housing that once upon a time was really only done by one-time grant funds or general fund money, and really leveraging those funds as much as we can. So that's very exciting to see. Prop 1 will be another way, and I know there's a lot of strategy going around right now as that's being rolled out in terms of how to make sure Prop 1 funding for new housing solutions can assist those with significant mental health needs. I mentioned earlier, including people with lived experience in the decision-making and how important that is to them, for them to be a part of the solutions moving forward. Bringing collaborative strategic plans with specific housing placement goals, right? You can have a stretch goal, you move towards it. It's always good to measure your progress, and then you can show accountability for that. And if you don't meet the goals, then why? What was the gap happening? Was it a regulatory issue? Was it a funding issue? Was it just a miscommunication issue? Learning as you go is really very important, but you can't do that unless you measure your progress as you go. Matching those social and health services to the individuals. As we're well aware, we know that not everyone needs the same thing at the same level at the same time. So really engaging with that personalized, customized approach. And then looking at both construction of new housing development, as well as how can we streamline regulatory processes as well. Some other basic strategies for improving homelessness as well is connecting with your COCs and public health and emergency management agencies. We saw this for sure during COVID, how important that was for that interconnection there. And especially with emergency management, I don't think those connections happened much before COVID. And so it is an emergency, obviously, living in an encampment. How can we bring that same kind of urgency and connection in this work? Enhancing and expanding the technical assistance. I will say a lot of times HUD and other federal partners do offer technical assistance to local agencies. And it's always worth making the ask if there's something there that you think you might need some assistance, whether it's looking at how to connect funding pieces together, to governance structures, to, a variety of different ways of asking for technical assistance. It may not be a funding check, but that expertise can really help you strategize and figure out what might work best in your community. And I mentioned connecting with state emergency management agencies and looking at the disaster response. I know we know that very well, dealing with Pajaro and Watsonville area during the atmospheric rivers and the flooding that happened there. And I know you have concerns in other areas related to riverbeds and streams, and how can we prepare for that? To that end, we're working with our federal partners in FEMA, and it should be rolled out soon. I'd be happy to share a disaster preparedness playbook that you can customize to your community, of not just, you already know how to prepare for natural disasters. You do that all the time as a county, but this is looking at the layer of how do you address people who are in an encampment in a high stress area when you see an impending atmospheric river coming or a wildland fire coming, and how do you address folks who are living in encampments in those vulnerable areas to help them move, not just the logistics part of it, but the kind of human-centered, trauma-informed approach to making that work too. And I'll end here and want to open it up for questions. I usually end a lot of my presentations with this slide that, ingredients for success that you could use for a variety of different opportunities, not just about preventing and ending homelessness. But the first one, of course, is political will. You need the political will, and that can come from an elected official, of course. You set the tone, you set the policies, you approve budgets. Homelessness, as I said, is a policy choice, and how you spend your funding has implications in terms of the responses to how things work, or scaling it up to where it needs to go. I will also say political will is embedded in all of us, that each of us have a role to play in moving the system forward in whatever role we play, whatever expertise we have, to be able to build on that strength and connect with others. The effective use of adequate resources, of course, everyone having more funding is usually a better thing. But at least to know that the money that you have on the table, you're not leaving money on the table, that you're using the money for its effective purpose, and discretionary funds for those pieces that truly need discretionary areas, but the pieces that are the funding opportunities that are for a specific use, you maximize the use of those funding. That collaborative approach is critical. There's so many people working on the same issue that don't know each other. How can you be a convener? How can you be a collaborator? How can you be a connector? And then finally, a never give up attitude. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from service providers, and certainly in my experience in Santa Barbara County, that it was that 10th time that someone was approached, or, that it was you tried for a certain grant and didn't get it, and then you finally got it. And, you know, you just keep on going, and things do get better with better expertise, with better collaboration, but not to give up, and how important that is. This is how you can get a hold of me. Of course, Roxanne knows how. I think we've been on speed dial lately, so we can certainly stay connected. And like I said, I'm just down the 101 in Santa Barbara County. Happy at some point. We did try to make this so I could be there in person. Didn't work out this time around, but I hope sometime in the future I'll be able to see things more on hand in person. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Schneider. This is an important topic. I know we started having it or we're gonna have it at our continuum of care in light of the Supreme Court case, in light of Governor Newsom's executive order, and I think some of his messaging, which changed recently, right? I think he was being much more vocal towards local governments to be more, I guess, proactive or more, he was encouraging more governments to engage in more of the encampment cleanups, right? And so it brought the question to our local providers and for our local governments to consider, in light of the recent major changes in Supreme Court precedent and the governor's approach. How do we formulate a policy incorporating these best practices so that we can engage in these cleanups, which the community is always asking for when these encampments start to grow? But how do we do it in the way that is, as you were pointing out, that does convey dignity and respect, but also incorporating the best practices? And have you seen other communities use all these 19 points to formulate on a policy, a protocol for their communities to be able to, because I know we would like to see what other communities have done. I know we always have to, make it particular to our area, to our region. But maybe you can speak to what some of the other
Sure.
best examples of communities incorporating what you just outlined for us.
Sure. And certainly, yeah. And I think the quick answer is, I think Monterey County and your COC, you have been doing a lot of really good work already, and it's just keep on going. Even the Supreme Court ruling pointed out, I think Chief Justice Gorsuch, who wrote the opinion in Grants Pass, said that states and cities are free to add additional substantive protections for people experiencing homelessness. And they said themselves that the 9 judges, they certainly were not the ones to dictate to local communities what works best for them. I just emphasize that because I think when the Grants Pass ruling came out, the decision came out, it did not necessarily mean that, okay, now we can just change what we're doing. There are things that you're doing that are working that you should keep doing, and looking at what can be done to connect people to housing and services, and putting the funding available to address those who are experiencing homelessness, and working with them, particularly in finding solutions for themselves. Throughout the state, and also on our website, we put on the 19 strategies. We also have some blog entries, some little essays on some community highlights. And I'll say that many communities do some things really well. No one community is doing everything perfectly, which is why we always say just go to so-and-so place and just replicate what they do. There's different challenges in different areas, but I will say the best practices that come up have to do with starting early in terms of connecting with your different agencies, with reaching out to the people in encampments, figuring out what is needed, and then trying to match those needs and not rush through it. It does take a long time to make it work well, The concern is trying to work something that might look good at the beginning because a certain area gets cleared up, but then the people have to go somewhere, and they have to, and they end up somewhere that may end up having you do repeating the same thing over and over again, spending more money actually managing a system and not solving the problem. So starting early and connection with them is very important. And that's also why we put in the 19 strategies how important it is to have a good communication line with your neighbors and business owners who see what they see, and to engage with them and explain about what you're trying to do, what is working, and when things work, to tell your story. Los Angeles is a whole different animal from most of the rest of the country and in California in terms of the number of people experiencing homelessness, but their approach is something that every community can do. Reaching out early, connecting with service providers, telling people what's going on, monitoring and keeping their data about how many encampment resolution programs they're doing, who they're working with, where they're going, and then creating a flow line from interim housing, and now they're working on more into the permanent housing space. They have to do it in a much larger scale, but I think the mechanisms of what Mayor Bass's Inside Safe and the county's Pathway Home is doing, there's components of there that any community can do. I would say the encampment resolution funds throughout the state and the approach that Monterey County is taking, my county and Santa Barbara, similar way of focusing on a particular area and making sure those connections happen, connecting with your housing authority, connecting with other nonprofit housing providers, in prioritizing people experiencing homelessness to get housing units available to them is very important. I'll also say in the work on veteran homelessness has been tremendous. And I know there's sometimes some areas where we can improve our streamlining processing with the VA. And that's something I can certainly be a federal partner in that capacity and connecting with your VA partners in terms of making sure that the services that they have are available and that we connect people to those services faster. So I would not look at the governor's executive order or the grants pass decision as a signal to change the good work that you're already doing. I do think that it's even more imperative to work in collaboration with your other partners in your region to make sure there's consistency and collaboration amongst your other partners. So I hope that helps.
Great, yeah. I think it just came up because in light of these major decisions, they seem to be a need to have the discussion, engage in the discussion, and then maybe create some best guidance or protocols for hopefully to encourage our local governments and our providers to follow when they're looking to engage in cleanups in their respective communities. Let's go to Supervisor Askew.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Helene, thank you so much for the presentation and for the work that you're doing and for the voices that you're bringing into the conversation. I had the opportunity to receive a presentation. You talked about housing is healthcare. I sit on the NACO, the National Association of Counties Health Policy Committee. And so the discussion about housing and homelessness has been highlighted in all of our recent conversations. You can't have health if you don't have housing. And so finding those ways to thread, weave the fabric of funding and services together has really been a challenge, as well as an opportunity that we're really thinking about. And I want to give credit where credit's due to the I'm going to say it wrong. The IHC, the agency, the federal agency, because this is what you've put out and what you just reviewed with us today is significantly improved over previous guidance that was available. And we've put in some of the programs that we do, some of our most effective programs right now for service providers, specifically around safe parking programs. That was actually discouraged, and some of the things that you're now recommending were things that were discouraged in previous guidance from ICH. So I just want to say thank you for hearing and seeing and understanding the nuances of what we're trying to achieve and how to get there. I am really concerned, I have to say, about the grants pass decision and what it means for the work that we've done and how we've been able to move forward. I think that prior to the overturning of Grants Pass, you know, I think that was probably one of the biggest reasons that we were able to get local jurisdictions to engage as, you know, part of the solution. It was necessary. It allowed us to gain the political will that was necessary to get local jurisdictions to bring housing shelters, housing solutions, housing services, homeless services into their communities. Because you had this weight of, if you want to address the encampment, you have to provide the alternative option. And it sort of forced everyone into saying, okay, we do want to provide services and housing in our community. I worry that we've lost that trigger that has allowed us to make the progress that we have. And I'm hoping that there is more that the federal government can do to reinstate that kind of pressure on local jurisdictions. So that's an ask that I would have of you. I'm also really, you know, concerned about the impact that, and I'd love to see more, I think, again, federal guidance about, you know, what it means when we force people who are homeless to move from place to place and lose their belongings and lose their security and lose their relationships and lose the community that they've built. Like it by default puts homeless people into a place of being criminalized in a way that costs all of our systems more money and decreases the safety of the surrounding communities and puts local cities at odds with each other when you're pushing people from one, you know, oh, that's the state land. Oh, push you over to the side of that fence. Now you're on the city land. Oh, we're going to move you over here. Now you're on the county land. Oh, now you're on the state parks land. Oh, now you're on the BLM land. I mean, we don't have the housing needed to move people into housing, and we're doing everything we can to make that happen. But figuring out how we deal with humane, at some point, we're going to have a conversation about what sanctioned encampments look like so that people have a place to exist and sleep and be safe. And I would love to get more guidance, I think, from ICH about what that looks like. Because we can talk all we want about, you know, the guidelines and the best practices, but the reality is we don't have beds. We have a family shelter here in Seaside with a waiting list of 200 people on it. We have the shelter in Salinas that we, you know, worked really hard to get up and running, and you know, it's got a waiting list. We have a safe parking program that feels like it's, you know, this force of nature to keep everyone on board and supportive of it. It's one of the cheapest, most effective programs that we have, but we've got a waiting list there. We don't have more places to send people. And in the absence of the best practice of have the housing available for folks, we need more guidance from the federal government and more resources in that upstream. Like, how do we respond to the crisis that's in front of us? Because it is a crisis. The last thing and comment I'll just make in terms of a couple other sort of federal pieces that I think would be helpful, you know, and I'll use this forum here to like send this back to you. The need to incentivize existing housing stock to be used as homes is something that, you know, we're talking about in these sort of one-offs here and there. But really it's our tax structure and our tax system that allows for, you know, housing to be used as investments. And prioritizes that over having housing be used for homes. And like, that's a conversation we're going to have at some point. We have 11,000 vacant homes in Monterey County. Like, we could solve our homelessness crisis here if we could, you know, and I know it's not as simple as what I just laid out, but like, that's the reality, right? In Tuolumne County, they have 25% of their housing is second or vacant homes. That would more than address the issues that we're addressing. And then the last thing I'll just mention is you mentioned FEMA, and FEMA as a federal partner, you know, given everything that Monterey County has been through, the stark reality that has become very clear and apparent to me, and you know, we're talking about power and power structures and power dynamics, but, you know, the way that FEMA doesn't provide support or isn't set up to provide support to individuals who are most likely of being hurt by climate disasters. If you don't have a home that you lost, FEMA isn't there to help you. If you don't have a rental agreement because you were living in a, you know, unpermitted structure, you're more likely to be impacted by climate disasters than someone who owns a home. But FEMA's there immediately when we had, 4 multi-million-dollar homes that were at risk, but we had to fight really hard to get FEMA to even show up or listen to us when we had hundreds of people who were displaced. But because they didn't have a value of the property that was lost, like somehow this all has to shift. And so I guess I'm telling you things you probably already know, but I'm also asking you, help us understand how we can be better advocates to voice these issues in the right venues. Because you said it, you said how homelessness is a policy choice, and there are so many policies that feel like they're unmovable and unshakable and unshiftable. But we're allowing those policies to continue to exist if we don't talk about them. So I really just appreciate the presentation. Roxanne, I appreciate everything you're doing. I'm firmly committed to, making sure that Monterey County, to the degree that we can, that we're going to continue to treat our unhoused residents with respect, with compassion, and that we're not going to create more trauma by simply allowing the bulldozing of where people are currently trying to, survive and create this adversarial dynamic with our neighboring jurisdictions. So I think we're going to have to figure out, and I'm looking at you, Supervisor Alejo, and the coalition to figure out, like, how can we have this conversation and be really clear about our values and how we treat our neighbors, recognizing that we do not have the housing stock that's necessary or the shelter beds that are necessary to simply move people and displace them. So I'll end my comments there, but thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts. And thank you again, Helene, so much for the work that you're doing.
No, thank you. You mentioned quite a few, like you said, things I already know, but it's always good hearing it from elected leaders like yourself and from local government in particular. And the federal government still has its work to do too. We are by no means perfect. There's a lot of things, FEMA being one of them, in terms of climate change and disaster preparedness. I think there's at least an effort through the Justice 40 initiative that is every agency, federal agency has to look at what they do with an equity lens, basically, and looking at the work with and environmental justice is becoming more and more an issue. I've been doing a lot of work with Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA and EPA in areas that, talking to people who all have to deal with the same challenges of people in encampments in infrastructure areas that's not only dangerous to the people involved, but also dangerous to undermining the infrastructure in the whole community. And so how does that all interconnect together are conversations that are currently happening, and you bring up some great points there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to the public. Any members of the public or any of our partners who want to comment on the presentation by Ms. Schneider?
I don't see any.
Nobody? All right. Well, the last thing I want to say, Ms. Schneider, on this was, yes, this work, it's in concept. We know the pieces that are needed, but it's not always easy to deliver. And I'll give an example of our Project Home Keys, our hotel conversion projects. We built a lot of collaboration, a lot of support to get some of these projects, both our COC, the county, with some of our cities, in particular, City of Salinas and King City. We seem to be moving forward, and things were going great up until the construction company did us wrong in this community. It really set us back. And when we were talking about what places can we convert more quickly and more affordably, those projects were real, right? So now we're in the process of trying to see how we could rescue some of these projects. And Roxanne has been really on the forefront with those partners because we're talking about, I don't know, almost 200 units that, well, it's real, where you could have places where we could get people off the street or living in cars or RVs and into an affordable and a better place to be housed. So I give that as an example that even though we're trying to do the right things and we get the funding and things are moving, sometimes some things are out of control when people don't do what they were supposed to do with that funding. And now there's all these efforts to try to save those projects. And put them back to what they were intended to do, which is to serve our residents experiencing homelessness. So that was one. The other piece that I would just convey, you talked about communication with our partners, but I think even when encampments are planned or are taking place, how do we convey to the public the right tone that captures these values and these goals that you outlined? Our COC is part of San Benito and Monterey County. It has both counties, and I haven't seen any local governments all of a sudden after the Supreme Court case or after the executive order start wanting to do encampment cleanups. I think those that did them, they already had those planned, but one of our recent neighboring counties did do that. And I think both Supervisor Askew and I saw the messaging on our local news. And I think I think we have to be intentional also when we're explaining things and to the public to how to not to paint everybody that is facing homelessness with a broad brush. Yes, I know there's frustration in the community, but I think it's important for us as elected officials not to express frustration against our homeless residents or against encampments, but to be, I guess, professional and clear on why, when we do engage in them, why they're needed, but not to try to demonize those residents in our community that are in those encampments. And I thought, for me, it was a recent example of how the messaging is also important as elected officials who go on the evening news and are explaining what's going to happen and why to the public at large. And I just thought that was another piece of where I think when we create these guidelines and protocols, I think that messaging needs to be very intentional and trying, at the same time, trying to convey respect and dignity for those that are living in these places in our communities. That's all I wanted to say, because it was just a recent example where I thought we could do better. So
Thank you. I followed the
Yes.
Home Key projects with a heavy heart. I was watching, particularly in King City with Mayor LaBar, and
Yes.
he even got a fire truck in order to get the project. I mean, just the whole, so
Right.
I really hope that there's an opportunity to find another way to make, because it was the right approach. And unfortunately, you had some players who were not playing by the rules, and you don't have the project that you deserve. So I hope there's some way that can be rectified. And appreciate your comments also about tone and message and how that impacts those listening to them, regardless of what their situation is. So please do continue to reach out, and thank you, Roxanne, again, and everyone for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you.
One more comment here.
One more comment, yes, thank you so much. What you said at the beginning was so interesting to me. Because you mentioned that during COVID, there was this concern that we might have a flood of new homeless, unhoused people. And yet we didn't, because we had programs in place such as rental assistance and child tax credit and other programs. And that's a policy choice not to continue those programs. So I guess my question is, are there any groups that are using that data, that real-time data? We did a study without intending to do a study and came up with programs that actually work. Are there groups that are pushing for policy change to say, we know what works and we have the data to prove it, so we just need money to fund some of these programs as a permanent program? Or is that not really happening? Or are they pushing against the data and saying that was a unique situation and so the data doesn't apply? Or
Yeah, no, there are many organizations on a national level. The National Alliance to End Homelessness to certainly have a lot of information to what you suggest here. Also, you see San Francisco in Margot Cushell's shop. There's been some statewide really good reporting coming out about the state of homelessness in the state of California and what worked and what hasn't worked and what people need. CSH has also done a housing needs assessment for the state of California to show what policies and fundings needed for the lack of housing units and to meet that gap. So there's a variety of different ways, whether it's at the federal level or at the state level. Housing California as well has another variety of different talking points, and they're working very hard right now, I know, in educating Californians on Prop 1 implementation to make sure that that policy that the voters voted in is now implemented in a way it was intended. So yes, there's plenty of opportunities and plenty of research and data out there to look into, and I can connect with Roxanne to connect you with all of that if needed.
All right, if there's no other comments, I think that was the end of our presentation. Thank you, Ms. Schneider. We really appreciate your help and your partnership with us, and we look forward to utilizing some of this information you presented to us as we look to have a broader discussion within our Continuum of Care Leadership Board. I think that's all I have. I think our next meeting is scheduled for near Thanksgiving. But I wanted to maybe just talk, maybe at our next meeting, get an update on those project home keys. I know by then we might have a lot more, hopefully some better news on some of those projects. And then I know I see Katrina McKenzie on the line. I think at our next board, we're looking to maybe postpone our homelessness summit and give more time to staff to work on that. But I know that's one of those topics as we were planning for October, but I know we're gonna need some more time. So maybe we could bring that up. Katrina, you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I was just going to be bringing it to the Leadership Council on Wednesday to postpone until spring of 2025 so that the coalition and its partners can really concentrate on the funding streams that are at hand and really wrap our brains around getting together as a community and addressing encampments and really in a coordinated and strategic, humane way. So that was something I'm going to bring up at the Leadership Council for approval. So really hope to get your support on that.
Yeah, it's pending, but we just, since we don't have a meeting till November, wanted to make sure we know some of these things are changing because of all the work on the table for.
Yeah.
All right, if there's no other comments or announcements.
Sorry, through the chair.
Yes, go ahead.
So in regards to the conversation about strategies to address encampments humanely and effectively, is this something that I know we tried to have a conversation, or there'd been a sort of a beginnings of a conversation around sort of county policies and county strategies. Is the coalition looking at developing regional agreements for how we move forward, given the grants pass ruling? Is that a conversation that's happening at the coalition, or is that a conversation that we need to sort of initiate from where the county, as a county?
Well, I think we were planning maybe for our next meeting, after next week, I think in September, to initiate the conversation, but it's, at least from the COC standpoint, it's not like we have jurisdiction over other cities to dictate how they carry out encampments. I think we're doing more, we're trying to engage more an approach of, can we create best guidance and protocols moving forward on how to best engage in encampments. I think that was some of the conversation, but it's we still have to have the conversation with the leadership board at large.
Okay, so I guess so the coalition is going to engage in that work about how regionally we what our sort of approach would be. And I mean, clearly it's voluntary for our cities, but I think that having clear local guidance to say, you know, hey, we're 12 cities and a county in a fairly small area. So anything, and with the state and with other partners, right? So anything that one community is doing is going to directly impact the neighboring community, the neighboring jurisdiction. So for us to be clear about, you know, what our values are and what our sort of guiding principles would be, I think is important. And I guess if I guess I'm just trying to understand, is that something that we need to engage in conversation with our staff and come up with some recommendations, maybe to bring to the coalition for conversation? Or is the coalition going to be the point, that the agency where that work gets initiated?
Well, it's not as clear, right? Because in one sense, we have worked hard to build collaboration, working relationships on trust on this topic, which several years ago did not exist. We built that up. And we also are very mindful that when cities want to engage in an encampment, that we're not, the county or the COC is not then in conflict with them wanting to do that. In fact, sometimes cities have received grants, for example, the city of Salinas, to do the cleanups. The Encampment Resolution Funds resulted in some of the biggest cleanups in Salinas in recent memory, along Gavilan Creek, for example, or on the other side of Car Lake. So some of these grants are intended, and it's I guess a delicate balance when the COC doesn't have jurisdiction to tell a city how to carry out its cleanups, but we are in a position with the intent that we also want to maintain the collaboration and working partnerships that we built so far, to at least put forward guidance and best practices and protocols of how to do those in the future, how to best do those in the future.
I guess I'm still not clear. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but you're asking about agreements, where the county is engaged in agreements, and agreements, it seems like you wanted to, that would mean like we're gonna put language in the future telling people, entities that we fund, how to engage in encampments and encampment cleanups.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying in the way that we have built some, I think, really and restored some trust and built some collaborative coalitions where there is sort of common agreement. I think it's important that, given the grants pass ruling, that we have that conversation about how we collectively intend, are there a set of values that everyone would agree on? We have the 5-year plan to end homelessness, and we have cities that have all signed on to that. So in the spirit of collaboration, in the spirit of making sure that we are, as much as possible, all sort of lining up in the same direction, I think my concern is, that we find ourselves in a situation where very quickly a lot of the trust building that's happened, that was in some ways sort of everyone's hand was forced because of the grants pass initial ruling. We're now back in a situation where we could very quickly find ourselves with one community doing cleanups without the commitment to provide housing for those residents, and moving people between communities. And that's what I'm saying. I'm just looking for like where. And if the coalition is not prepared to, or you're not prepared to bring this to the coalition to have that conversation, then I think this is a conversation that we, as the homelessness committee of the county, need to draft out. What are some of the guidelines, and then shop those around to say, is there agreement? Where would we find agreement with our 12 counties around how we move forward with encampment resolutions, given the overturning of grants pass?
Well, from my perspective, as the chair of the COC, I don't think the grants, the prior cases, the Boise prior cases, were the driving force for collaboration. I think the driving force was really the funding, because when we started getting the HEAP and then the subsequent rounds of PAC, I think that's where the cap, because we were meeting and not just talking about the things we want to do and that we should do. We actually had funding, significant funding streams to actually do the work. That's when at least I saw more of the mayors, more of the providers, and more attendance at our continuum of care meetings, because we actually had funding streams to do this kind of work. But just on your point, we're about to have the conversations on the COC side, and that's what we look forward to having, hopefully in our subsequent meeting after next week.
Okay, so for anyone who's interested in engaging in the conversation, it sounds like the conversation will be moving to the COC around trying to build out or think about what some regional agreements might look like. I appreciate that, having the money definitely brought people to the table, but I can also see in the conversations I've had that, it wasn't just the money, because there've been times where we've had resources available and people still said no to welcoming services and housing for our homeless residents into their community. So I think it's maybe multi-pronged, multi-factored, and I just want to make sure that we're being proactive in how we think about it and how we talk about it and how we continue to work, how we recommit to continuing to work collaboratively between our local jurisdictions, because there is trust, but sometimes it's tenuous, and all it takes is one encampment cleanup where people are moved from one city to the next city to undo some of the hard work that's been done over the years. So I guess I'll leave my final comment will just be, I'm committed to making sure that we continue to build on the good work that's happened. And I do have some anxieties about how the grants pass ruling could undo some of the good work and good relationship building that we've had in the past. So if I could ask our county staff, Roxanne, if you see that happening, or if you see the need for some coordinated conversation about what our values are collectively and how we intend to work together, please bring that to our attention here at this committee so that we can engage in that conversation.
Sure, if I can respond to that
Yes.
really quick. One of my strategies is definitely about education, which is why we brought UCSF or the usage here today to kind of kick that off. I do have many conversations with local jurisdictions and also jurisdictions outside of Monterey County, just trying to keep my finger on the pulse of how other communities are responding. To that end, I held a meeting with Alameda County, LA, Sacramento, and there's like 6 counties, maybe more, in the meeting that I had last week, and we're really starting to dig into what would our policies look like. I do plan on bringing a draft to this body, hopefully at the next meeting, for input from our committee members, and then also just hoping to be the model for our partner our city jurisdictions, and really exploring what does it take for us to build the collaboration, not just internally within our own departments, but also with external partners like the Housing Authority and the Continuum of Care, all of the other very important entities that are working on addressing homelessness. And hopefully, our local cities can reach out. Well, they always can reach out to me if they have any questions once we roll out our policies.
Got it. Thank you very much for that. I'll look forward to that agenda item at our November meeting.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.